We're going to be on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Apparently, I don't have enough followers on Twitter yet to go live on Twitter. But I'm hoping somebody out there in the universe hears me and they're like, oh, Marina should get more followers. Hey, everybody, welcome to Unbossed. This is the Unbossed Women Founder Spotlight. And today I have actually a guest who I did interview. I don't know, was it last year? Her name is Cheryl Kemp, and she's come back to Unbossed to tell us a little bit about her journey and the company that ultimately now, as you'll hear, did not succeed. But she is a strong founder. She is resilient. She works so hard. And I love to have her here today to talk about that journey and how that went. So, welcome, Cheryl.
Thank you so much for having me again. I'm excited for a second appearance on Unbossed.
Thank you so much for coming. Should we start with talking a little bit about, because I know we cover like all of your founder's journey in our other podcasts. So
Yeah.
I'll put the link there. I'll recommend everybody go listen to that. But let's tell the audience right now, what was the company, and a little bit about, like what was the, 2 year? No, it was more than 2 years,
Close to
right?
two,
2 year.
just under two.
Yeah, two
Yeah.
year, like a little bit of a summary of that 2 year journey.
Yeah. So I spent the last between year and a half and 2 years building a company called IndieFit. We were a business management platform for fitness entrepreneurs. And so what that meant is in the very early stages of COVID, I think a lot of us now know the story that, of course, when studios and gyms closed, so many fitness instructors decided to be resilient and just become entrepreneurs overnight. And so I was really inspired in the early stages of COVID by these fitness instructors who were suddenly monetizing their communities directly, making more money, and building their own businesses. But I found that so frequently they were doing it with tools like Venmo or Google Forms, and really felt like there was room in the market to build a software platform that was really designed for the individual entrepreneur, sort of the business in a box, if you will. So we were never working with, a brick and mortar studio or anything like that. And we had an incredible journey. We learned so much. I think I look back on, spending the last year and a half or so of my life on this, and I compare it to other ways that I could have spent that time. And I just undeniably feel like this was the path that taught me more than I could ever possibly hope to learn in that time frame. And so ultimately, we did make the decision just this month, actually, to dissolve the company, which is a super difficult decision. I'm sure we're going to unpack so much of how I thought about that, how I arrived at that decision, and everything that happened afterwards.
Yeah.
But this is the end of IndieFitz chapter as a company, but definitely not the end of my story as a founder, is kind of how I think about it. And a quote that I love on this is founders are founders forever, whether or not they're tied to an active venture. And I think that's kind of how I identify. I'm like, I didn't lose my founder
Yeah.
card in this process. I am still a founder. I intend to, build other companies in the future. But right this moment, I am a companyless founder.
Yeah, I also have known of your background of having what some authors called a multi-hyphens, right? Meaning like you, as a intersectional person, don't only do one thing, don't only identify as one thing. And so it seems very fitting that you think of it that way, where you've done multiple things in different industries, and it's all come back to being a multi-company founders, because I know you'll be successful in the next venture or the next one and the next one, moving forward.
Thank
I was
you.
just
We've got nothing but time ahead of us, right?
yeah, I was just telling Cheryl actually, like, that I admire her so much because she's so resilient and inspirational to me. Because regardless of this, I don't even know if we should call it like failure. Maybe we should call it learning. This learning experience. It, I can see you. I want to talk to you about your growth. So maybe let's start there. Like, what are some of the things that, thinking back now, and I'm sure you've had a little bit of time to reflect on this, and if you haven't, I don't want to force you into that path, but if you have, what are some of the things that you've learned from this experience?
So much. What's that classic saying? Like hindsight is 2020. I think
Yes.
it's an easy trap to fall into where you do a ton
Yeah.
of reflection while you're going through this unwinding process. And I will admit I've been tempted to go through that reflection process and almost be critical of myself. And so I've looked at some of these learnings as like, why didn't I do this differently? And I am making a very mindful, intentional decision to cut that out because I just
Yes.
don't think it's productive. And obviously, like hindsight is 2020. So I'm gonna see things now that were not necessarily realistic to see at the time. But a few big learnings that stand out for me, first off, is just the concept of like understanding little things and big things, right? I feel like I have a different yardstick now for evaluating what's actually important. Because once you go through this first time founder experience, you get to the end of it, and the outcome is shutting down the company, it's really easy to look back on some of the little things that you maybe spent too much time on or you over optimized for, and you realize that that time was never going to change the outcome of the company. So I think about this as, if you're building an early stage company, your one job is to prove product market fit. And you have to be really critical about understanding like what are the assumptions about the business, the customer, the market that are the most critical assumptions you're making about your business that are truly going to determine success or failure. And how do you optimize literally everything you're doing around just those things? And so I think a couple examples that stand out in my mind are I remember us like super over engineering our logo. And I look back and I'm like, a beautiful logo was never going to change this market, right? Like it was never going to help us find product market fit. And I think there's other decisions like that, whether we invested in them with our time or whether we invested in them with our money. There's just a handful of things that I think I would simplify my life when I do this again and really laser focus on the most important things. So that stands out as a big one.
What
I
is
have one or two
sorry,
others, but
yeah, hold
comment
on
on
for a
that
second.
one.
Yeah, because I want to dig into a little bit more of that. If you had like a tool that maybe you and I can create and say like, this is the product market fit, focus 5 items, what, or
Yeah.
whatever items list it is, what are like those most important things that you need to accomplish or check in order to make sure that that is your laser focus approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think, product market fit is this thing that's really tough to define, but there's
Yeah.
some obvious inputs to it, right? There needs
Yeah.
to be a large enough market for what you're doing that you can actually build a
Yeah.
business in that
Yeah.
market. You sort of have to validate like who the customer is and the fact that they want your solution and they're willing to pay for it, right? And then
Yes.
you have to prove that you can get them efficiently in a repeatable way. And so, I kind of think about all of these inputs to product market fit. For us, I think the one that became, sort of the downfall of the company was the size. It was a couple things, but it was the size of the market is the big one. And so I look back and
Interesting.
I don't think that we spent enough time validating like how many, not just how many fitness instructors out there had an interest in being entrepreneurial and doing their own thing, but how many of them really were going to build a thriving business? Like how many of them were going to succeed at it and take it seriously in a sustainable long-term way? So that's kind of how I think about it. Maybe there is some sort of cool tool that we could collaborate on in terms of sort of mapping like market, customer, pricing strategy, distribution strategy, and being laser focused in terms of just those things. Maybe not like what's the color palette, what does it look like, let's go get some hot PR article. Like a lot of these things don't actually prove product market fit.
That is very, very insightful. And so in terms of like also focusing on your end user, right, as well. So like that was because your application or your IndieFit was like a two-sided, they call it two-sided market probably, where maybe I'm confusing the term, but it's basically a platform in which there has to be fitness instructors in there providing content, and also there has to be people that want to subscribe to that content. So it creates this value, right?
Somewhat. So the difference with IndieFit is we were actually not a two-sided marketplace in the sense that IndieFit was not a consumer brand. So if we're using like DoorDash as an example, DoorDash is selling restaurants and marketing directly to consumers. The difference with IndieFit is we were more of a software platform, so we were closer to white label. So basically, we sold to a fitness instructor, and then they used our tools to power their own business, had full ownership of their clients, and they were the brand, not us. But you're not wrong, though, in the sense that in order for this whole thing to work, they need a sustainable base of clients. And to some extent, we always wanted to help them with that. But that was really the meaty problem that sort of like was the straw that broke the camel's back, was these instructors building successful businesses turned out to be way more of an uphill climb than we ever could have imagined.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Okay, so what was the other two big lessons that
Yeah,
thinking about?
and it's so tough to be like succinct and boil these down because it's a
Yes.
million things. But another one that really stands out for me, which I somewhat touched on in that first point, is the idea of like biasing for distribution. And there's a quote I really like on this too. It came from Eric over at the Hustle Fund. And I heard him say this like probably well over a year ago, and it just burned into my brain. It hit me so hard. He said that first time founders tell you what they're building, and repeat founders tell you how. And I think that's such an insightful point, right? Because I think like as entrepreneurs, we're often hardwired to think in problem and solution. And we think in a very product driven way often, where it's like, okay, the customer has this problem. Here's the solution. And I'm just going to obsess about like, what is the solution? A lot of people forget that if you don't have a sustainable strategy for getting that solution in their hands, it can never go anywhere. And so when
Yeah.
I think about the IndieFit journey, we had an
Yeah.
amazing product, right? I think it was a great
Yes.
solution to powering a fitness business. But where things started to break down for us was we had a customer that was a very fragmented customer, right? So you have to
Yes.
go after them one by one by
One by
one, and
one.
they're micro entrepreneurs. There wasn't necessarily an easy, like, enterprise partnerships play, right? Or like any way to get a lot of scale of instructors in a single deal. And so where this really broke down for us was it was really hard to acquire our customer. And so, problem solution might have been a slam dunk, but distribution was an important point that I think I didn't obsess about enough early in the journey.
I like that. I hear you very clear when you explain it, but what does it look like from a founder perspective when they speak about the what versus the how? Because I
Yeah, I
want to
mean,
make that differentiation.
yeah, it's
What
a
is
great
a,
question.
how would you explain like in the fit as a what versus in the fit as a how? Or,
Yeah, I mean,
any company really.
yeah, absolutely. I think IndieFit as a what is really focusing on like what does our product do and what does our company stand for. So and actually
Right.
I probably broke my own rule because I think the way I described it when we kicked off is probably a very what driven statement. And so
Yeah.
IndieFit is a what is IndieFit is a business management platform for fitness instructors. It does this and this and this and this, right? It does video on
Right.
demand, it powers promo codes, it powers automated marketing. This is a lot of what, and it's really focused on what our product does. Where a how might come in is like IndieFit is a platform that empowers fitness instructors to build a great business. We connect with instructors by leveraging affiliate partnerships with graphic designers and business coaches, right? We have a strong referral network. We have a direct sales playbook that is repeatable and efficient, reaching out to instructors on Instagram. And I wish that some of those statements were true, but in fact, we had a very inefficient customer acquisition playbook, which was one of our challenges. But I think where the rubber meets the road on this in terms of practical advice is I've seen a lot of founders who get so obsessed with that what that they go spend a lot of time and money building the thing, like building the product. And maybe where you should invest some time and energy early is on demand testing, right? So like maybe
Wow.
the product doesn't exist at all. Maybe you stand up a landing page talking about it and you really run fire drills against like, how do I think I'm going to get customers, and then go prove that you can actually do that. And I think for us, there was bias in this process because the market just changed wildly through different stages of COVID. So we did actually have signals in 2020 that we were going to have a really efficient acquisition playbook. It just unfortunately changed over time. But I'll still carry this lesson with me forever of like validate your distribution channels and validate them early and as inexpensively as possible.
I love it. My wheels are turning in my head because I share with you that I am thinking about potentially starting a venture,
Yeah.
and I'm like thinking about, okay, like let me take note of all of this, and I'm gonna go figure it out. What is the third thing that you wanted to mention? Have
The third
fun.
one is a simple one, actually. And it's also very related to the first point. But the third one is just the most important question that I'll ever ask myself going forward on any venture
Wow.
that I'm working on is what is the
I mean,
riskiest assumption I'm making about my business? Like that in a sentence, I think is an important thing. Like wake up in the morning and ask that question. Ask it every day. Maybe the answer is going to change. But I think for IndieFit, the riskiest assumption that we made was that the average independent fitness instructor could build a thriving business on their own. And I think that we had major blind spots to, how constrained they were in terms of like marketing channels that they had at their disposal. We had a major blind spot for the scarcity of the consumer and just how difficult it would be for them to, find and build a community in a world where they're competing with Peloton and Apple Fitness and free YouTube workouts, right? And gyms and studios and all these other things. And the way that I sort of explain this, where I think we got it wrong a little bit, is this analogy where I now realize that like building business management tools for somebody who's having trouble building a thriving business is a little bit like giving somebody like a beautiful set of cutlery to eat dinner with during a famine. And it's like, yeah, having the right tools to eat my food with doesn't help me if I don't know where the food on the plate is coming from. And so, it's this analogy
totally.
that sort of sums up the whole thing for me. And I now realize that that one risky assumption had the power to invalidate our entire market and business, and we didn't want to see it. And so we were just like, no, 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 there's a market. Like look at this, small group of instructors that sort of exemplifies like what this could look like. And what we didn't realize is that they were the 5%, not the 95%. The 95%,
Right.
looked more like a revolving door in terms of like acquisition and churn.
What would you say about and basically that what you're telling me is that 5% was valid, but maybe was not a big enough market to make a business around, right?
Yeah.
Because if that five or top 10% of fitness instructors that actually do have a community, like actually do want to build and
Yeah.
actually do want to do all things, did you find that those were maybe a better fit for your product?
Yeah.
And what was the rub there? Maybe could you have focused on those, like thinking back? I'm just curious about it because sometimes the reason why I'm asking, let me give you the reason why I'm asking this question is because there's a lot of advice out there that says focus on your specific customer, right? And
Yeah.
that needs to be as specific as possible and as niche as possible. If you're selling to everybody, you're selling to nobody, right? How do you reconcile this two? And maybe I am. How do you help me understand these two differences? I guess.
Yeah, well, I think it depends how you define a niche, right? Because if
Okay.
we could look at this a different way through IndieFit, because
Yeah.
there are other platforms out there that are business management tools for everything, right? So there's platforms out there that are like, hey, fitness instructor, private chef, coach, podcaster, right? Like here's a platform where you can power your business. And some interesting
Right.
examples are like Patreon or Gumroad, right? Like these are creator
Yeah.
platforms for everyone. And so we actually thought that by just picking fitness instructors, we had already picked a niche, right? We had picked a niche inside a much larger creator economy. And then there were niches inside of niches, right? Because we could focus on like yoga instructors. We could focus on people with over 50,000 Instagram followers. And, I do believe in being laser focused, but I think that you also have to be laser focused with mindfulness around can I maintain this level of focus while scaling a business? Because if you're too laser focused, you're going to run out of market and runway really quickly. And you might have not validated or thought about like the next customer that you're going to have to go after when you run out of runway with your very, very focused laser niche. And so the way we always defined our niche was fitness instructors. We didn't necessarily dial in too much more than that. And unfortunately, I do think that even fitness instructors, which sounded to us like, oh, there's 400,000 of them in the US, like this is absolutely a large enough market. It turned out that our market was not, our TAM was not all fitness instructors and trainers in the US. It was all fitness instructors and trainers with an interest in building their own business who can actually succeed at it. And that turned out to be a little baby market. And on a mission driven level, that stings, you know, because like the failure of our company is almost predicated on the failure of so many micro entrepreneurs businesses. And you know, that's something that I am spending some of my time now connecting with players who remain in the space to just bounce ideas with them and try to be a resource and a helper in terms of like, how do you actually be a part of the solution that makes this long tail of instructors successful, right? It's not just giving them tools and software. It's got to be more like advisory, consultative. You know, you have to kind of like help them market themselves and help them access viable marketing channels. But unfortunately, that was just not the way that we engineered our value propositions. And in retrospect, I, to some extent, wish it was. But that's another thing that's sort of like hindsight is 2020. You live and you learn.
Yeah, I've as part of doing customer interviews for a different project, I have noticed that generally small businesses, direct to consumer brands, or people that make products and sell directly to users online have a really, really hard time finding their customers
Yeah.
and talking about their business and doing all of that efficiently enough where they can actually be found. And I think found here is also a keyword because the internet is extremely vast. As human beings, when we look for things, we don't look really hard unless there's a big enough pain that is around that process.
Yeah.
And so we tend to go with the easiest, like, oh, this is what I found, or this is free, or this is what everybody else uses, or this is what I know how to use, right?
Yeah.
And so I have noticed that as well in similar, not exactly the same, but similar players, small businesses online, which gets me to a question that maybe is more a little bit like pie in the sky, but is like, how do you succeed in today's world as a small business? And there's not like, I feel like there's not that many plays. There is social media, which is like, 4 players, maybe 5 players.
Yeah.
And advertising, and I think I don't know what else, honestly,
It's so
right?
tricky. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's like we don't live in a society of normal distribution. We live in a society of outliers. We live in a
Yes.
society where, it's winner take all, right? Like the number one in each category
Yeah.
will take 80% of that category and everybody else can fight for the 20%. And that's a tricky thing because it's like almost every industry and category and space follows this rule. And so to really solve this problem, it's like you've got to change consumer behavior. So I'm very interested in this. I mean, obviously, throughout my entire career, as we mentioned on the last episode that I did, pre IndieFit, I spent almost 10 years working in the food delivery and food tech space. And
Yes.
so, what that boiled down to was still enablement of a small business, right? It just happened to
Yes.
be a restaurant. And it was all about helping them, access new use cases via delivery or like peer-to-peer social delivery in the case of Ritual. And so I've spent now a decade just thinking
Yes.
about like, how do you arm the rebels? How do you empower small businesses? And
Yep.
I hate to say this, but like 10 years in, I now think it's harder than it even was at the start, right? And I
I
think
agree.
it's actually maybe a product of what is a really awesome shift in our society, which is it's never been easier to be an entrepreneur and start your own business. So I mean, we're living in the
Yes.
days of no code, Shopify, right? And like if we just look at Shopify as an example,
Yes.
Shopify has democratized e-commerce to
Yep.
such an extent that it's like now this question of just how on earth do you get your share of the pie when there's millions and millions of people reaching for a slice. And I wish I had like more sage wisdom here in terms of what the solution is, but I feel like where I'm at on this journey now is just I know and believe that helping small businesses market themselves is a bigger problem than it's ever been. And I don't know what the solution is, but I do think that that's one of the problems that I will probably noodle on a lot in the years to come when I think
Yeah.
about other things I might want to build in the future.
Yeah, and you're so right. Especially, I love the way how you said like this, like winner take all.
Yeah.
But I do think that is not only a consumer problem, to be honest. As I think about it a little bit from how we have built the internet thus far, and how there are oligopolies or monopolies that
Yeah.
monitor and control what you see, it's I think is part of their they have responsibility in this winner take all model because they
Yeah.
are in the winner take all model. And so I don't know if you've been following Web3 trends and
Big time.
metaverse and omniverse and blockchain technology. I am really hoping maybe somebody hears this or you get to work on that one day where we design those newer systems to be more fairly distributed.
Right.
And the competition can be more fair. Right now, the competition, I strongly believe, it is not fair. It is not fairly distributed. Even in social media and social media companies, the more money you have, the more advertising you can do, the more
Yeah.
customers you'll get. And so that is not a fair business model. And honestly, I don't think that was how we envisioned the internet should have been created, or what the original premise of being online and being on the internet should have been in the first place.
No,
I
I'm
know
with you
that's, I,
100% on this.
I know
The
it's a lot, but
gatekeepers, you know,
yeah, it's a
and this is what's
gatekeeper.
interesting is like you're speaking to somebody who was a platform founder for the last
Yeah,
2 years, right? And
yeah.
I think so much of this Web3 dialogue is about the downfall of platforms. And to some extent, I do buy in, right? Like even though we were building a platform for the last 2 years, I think there's some interesting things that we saw at the tail end of our time in this market. And one thing we haven't mentioned yet actually in our conversation was, how did we actually make the decision to shut down, and like what are the events that led up to that?
Yeah.
And actually one of the events that led up to it was a really public shutdown of one of the largest players in our category. And this particular player had raised a $17 million Series A just 2 months before they shut down. And so it was this like shocking, horrific thing. And they, communicated the news to their partners very suddenly. And we got to see the ripple effect of what happened afterwards. And what was really interesting is when we talked to these entrepreneurs who had been building their business on this larger platform and got displaced, there was a tremendous sense of distrust towards platforms in general. And we saw so many people reaching for Squarespace, for example, right? Because Squarespace gave them, whether real or perceived, it gave them a sense of ownership and control that a platform did not. And I was
What it?
really inspired in these
Yeah.
conversations because I was like, I'm witnessing the downfall of platforms. Like, this is what the Web3 narrative is all about. And I feel like
Yeah.
this experience is pushing me in a direction of really buying into that and really
Yeah.
wanting to be a part of it.
What is a platform as you defined it here, and what does Squarespace do that platform does not do, for example?
So this is actually a brilliant question because at the end of the day, like Squarespace is the same. You know what I mean? It's
It's a
like you are
platform.
choosing to store your data,
Yeah.
payment on file,
Yeah.
you are choosing to let all of that live somewhere that somebody
Yeah.
else can access it. And if they decided to turn it off at any moment, they could do that, or they could
Yeah.
change the algorithm, right? And it might like drastically change how your business
Totally.
functions. I think the perception from the customer is a little bit of like it's not black and white, it's a spectrum, right? It's a spectrum from marketplace to fully white label. If something is fully white label, I think you perceive it more as like, this is mine. And we were close to fully white label, but not 100%. And so I think that's the difference between how IndieFit is perceived and how Squarespace is perceived, right? Is like IndieFit still says powered by IndieFit at the bottom. You can sniff out the fact that this is like a startup that relies on venture funding to exist. And so, if they cease to have that capital, they might cease to exist. And so it's just interesting. I think that we watch the customer in our market become much more informed about what risks they were taking by trusting a third party in their business. And I think we're seeing that across all small businesses, right? Like people
Yeah.
are learning to ask smarter, more critical questions
Yeah.
about, why should I partner with you? Why should I trust you? And this exists in food delivery too, right? Which is the other world that I came from. I
Yeah.
think restaurants are selecting trusted partners in a much more thoughtful way. And I think that that is fantastic progress, right? Like that's progress towards a more democratized, fair future, just like you said.
I love that. And um, I, I'm still unsure of the downfall of the platform play. And I know you've said it a couple of times. The consumers are getting more intelligent or smart about how they're asking those questions. What what do you think is going to replace the platform in a Web3 or other world potentially?
See, I don't think we know yet. I mean, if I'm speaking for
Okay.
myself, I don't know yet. And
Yeah.
I think right now what we have in Web3 is an ethos, right? Like we
Yes.
have an ethos that is a spirit of decentralization and democratization. And I do believe that that's the right ethos and spirit, but
Yeah.
I don't know that the building blocks are out there yet. And my
Yeah.
co-founder Brandon and I have just kind of like jammed on a couple of things. And given the infrastructure that currently exists, we consistently come back to like, oh, well, we couldn't build that because it would be way too expensive in gas, right? Like if someone's not familiar with that term, it's like gas is like processing and operating fees that you have to pay on like a per transaction basis to like make changes on the blockchain. And so, there's a variety of forces at play right now that either make solutions like not technically viable, not financially viable. So I think we're still like a tiny bit, we still live in Web 2 right now, right? Like as much as we're starting to all get curious and excited about where the future is, I don't feel like the future is like on our front doorstep yet. So I think the way that we think about this as entrepreneurs is like terms like platform or decentralization are like kind of fluid to us, and they're
Yeah.
sort of like a theme and an ethos. And so it's like, how do we build around those themes, knowing that maybe the technology that's going to unlock the right solution just isn't here quite yet, but it's being thought about or built as we speak.
Totally.
Do you
I
have any
love that.
thoughts on this? I'm super curious.
Oh man, I don't know that I've given it enough thought yet to form an intelligent, you know, even like solution or something like
Yeah.
that. But I my ethos, I guess, if I had an ethos or if I had a dream state, um, would be that um, the Google of the worlds would no longer be a thing in which
Yeah.
we can actually have search search across multi nodes where each search is vertical or even industry or even whatever market specific, right? And so, but at the same time, because of how people work, there needs to be aggregators and services that really like target consumers in many ways. And I don't want that to be four players. I want that to be, many players
Right.
potentially. It's just really hard to envision something that it is not today because we're so, like you said, we're so stuck in what today is. Like one of the examples that I love to give the most is Reddit and Stack Overflow, Wikipedia. They are, if people may not see it as such, but they are all Google competitors for search,
Yeah.
right? Like it has come to a point in which Medium, even, I feel like for me in my life, has come a Google competitor because sometimes I will go on Medium before I search something on even Google. I will go on Reddit and say, put in something in Google that says something something Reddit or something something Stack Overflow or something something Medium, right? And so there is a trend that people are wanting to not want to be controlled, you know, like I don't want you to control the information I'm getting. I want to go
Right.
and get my information, and I am excited about seeing the future of ranking even,
Yeah.
because ranking right now is like one side, right? Like, give me the best recommendation for me. Well, what if I want something different? What if I want something completely out of the box that it has nothing to do about who I am or where I'm at or how many kids I have or, you know, whatever it is. I want to see what Cheryl sees. I don't
Yeah.
have access to that today, but I would love to be like, oh, I wonder, you know, I wonder what I would see if like I was somebody else. And so a lot of people are using incognito windows or using like,
Hmm.
there's all these trends about going more anonymous on the internet and I feel like having a different perspective of what being served today, which is like all in the same and the same it's just
Yeah.
so heavy. It feels
I know.
heavy.
It's like personalization is a buzzword, and it's usually viewed as something very positive, right? It's like, oh, we're going to curate and surface all these things that our algorithm says that you're going to like, right? So it's super personalized to you. But I think the downside of that is like personalization makes us homogenous, right? It makes us always the same. It's like, okay, if this is what your algorithm has learned, I like and I want to see, this is now all I'm ever gonna like and see. How do I get exposed to things that are different? How do I evolve, right? Like how do I expand that set of what I expose myself to?
Yeah.
So it sounds like you and I very much on a like concept level, like we're in the same place in terms of being bullish and interested in this. And I'm in the very early stages of my own Web3 journey, right? So I don't think we have like super obvious business ideas that we're going to run out and build
Yeah.
tomorrow. But I've been trying to ramp myself up, just from a personal education standpoint,
Absolutely.
what's actually happening, right? Like,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
I keep mentioning the word ethos, it's like I'm
Yeah.
trying to internalize it and digest it on a concept level right now. And then
Yeah.
I think I can graduate to, some
Yeah.
greater specifics in the future.
Yeah, and the one last thing about personalization, the thing that I think is the biggest fault of personalization is the fact that is reinforced learning, meaning
Yeah.
like it learns based on your past, not on your future. And that's like, to me, that's really scary. Like, I don't want to live in my past. I don't want to continue to be in the person who I was before. I am an evolving human being that looks at the future. And so that's like the biggest gap to me is and like a machine cannot predict what I want to be, who I want to be, and where I'm
Right.
going. And so it's going to be really hard to figure this out, but I hope in some way we make it better,
Yeah.
and more open.
Totally
Can we
agree.
talk? Can we talk about a little bit of the decision moment and
Yes.
at what point? Maybe it's not a point. Maybe it's a journey. Did you know you had to shut down the company, and how did you come to that conclusion?
Yeah. It's a tough journey. And I think, a lot of people after this decision was made have been asking me, and I mean, I appreciate the question, but so many people are asking me like, how are you? How are you feeling? And the answer that I keep giving everyone is like, listen, I feel great now, right? Like once you're on the backside of this decision, you're being flooded by support, you have this like lightness and freedom and flexibility about you. You have the optimism of thinking about the future and what's next. But I think what people don't realize sometimes is like the hard part and the negative emotions are actually buried in the time leading up to the decision. Like the worst you feel is when you're waking up every single day and trying to be a self-starter, and you're trying to manufacture energy as a founder, and you're trying to manufacture enough energy to power yourself and your whole team,
Yeah.
right? Like you're the person that everyone's looking at in terms of like, okay, how are we feeling? How are we doing? Are things going well? Are we in a good place? Like they're looking at the founder. And so I think I had a tough couple of weeks and months leading up to this because I did see negative signals, and I did have that founder intuition that it wasn't working. It wasn't heading in the direction that we hoped it was, or at least it wasn't heading there fast enough. That was an interesting time for me. And there's a couple of resources that helped me. And I definitely intend to like write some of this up on my blog and try to, put some of this out there for people who might be in that like quiet, hidden, hard part of the journey. Because that's a big secret and a big weight to be carrying on your shoulders without telling anybody. Because you don't tell people, right? Like when
Yeah.
people are like, "Oh, how's IndieFit? How's your company?" You're like, "Great." Like you don't start unloading on, our market is shrinking. We have a churn fire. Like you don't like you don't start unloading this information on people. So something that actually helped me was an awesome book that I read, and it's called The Dip by Seth Godin. And basically the premise of this book is it's a roadmap of when to quit, when to stick, and when to pivot. And I kind of think those are the three exhaustive choices, right? Like you
Yeah.
either keep going, you stop, or you change something. And the premise of this book is basically that the goal of everything that you do should be to be the best in the world. And that means that like you should be the best person in the world to be building the company that you're building. Your company should be the best in the world at the thing that it offers.
I love it.
And
Yeah.
like, you're not going to get there overnight as an early stage startup, but that should be the goal, right? Like the mentality should be, we are going to be the absolute best at this. And the book basically tells you if you're not going to be the best in the world, there's an opportunity cost here, right? Because you're not pursuing something else that you maybe could be the best in the world at. And so that was something I really sat with because I was asking myself two questions within that. I was asking myself, is IndieFit the company that's going to win our space, right? Because it was a very competitive category, given that this opportunity sort of showed itself in the early stages of COVID, and a lot of founders saw this opportunity. And then the second question within that is like, am I the best founder to be building this business? And what I ultimately realized was, the market size for what we offered seemed to be very obviously shrinking. And so, in the context of feeling like, shrinking market, other players in the space, how do we differentiate? Are we going to be the best in the world at this? I started to realize the answer was no. And the hard part about this was actually a very personal introspective decision, which was thinking about myself as a founder for this company, and then thinking about myself as like anything else I could go do. Right. So like in the infinite number of possibilities of ways that I could spend my time, whether that's building a different company, being a consultant, helping other founders, being an employee, right? There's all these different options. Is this the thing that is like the greatest manifestation of me? And am I the best person for this? And something that I had to be honest with myself about, which was a really hard truth, was actually examining my founder market fit. And so I felt that, for the majority of the journey, I felt like a great founder for IndieFit because I was like, I have this tech background and I'm leveraging that tech background to solve a customer or to empower a customer that I loved as a passionate fitness consumer. And I thought that the solution that they needed was very much driven by software. And the further into the journey that I got, the more I realized like they need help building the business and making the business viable. Like they don't just need software to run it. They need advisory, they need consultancy, they need marketing coaching. And the more that
Yeah.
I examined that, the more I realized like I have never built a fitness business, right? Like who
Yeah.
am I to be the best expert in the world on how they should do this if I myself have not done it? And of
Yeah.
course, we made key hires, right? Like we had key hires that were fitness instructors themselves and like super knowledgeable on this topic. But I started to realize two things. I started to realize like we are not going to win this space. and whether that's based on timing or what have you. And I'm probably not the best example of founder market fit for this company on the planet. And I think that that's the bar that I want to have for myself, right? Like I want to
Yeah.
build the thing that is the absolute best use of my very limited time on this earth, right? And I want to build something that can be the number one, best solution for that customer of its kind.
Totally. I like that founder product market fit conversation. Is this a conversation that you find to have you've found to have with other founders as well?
I have, yeah. And the reality is it can change. Because, when you start building a business, you have a certain set of information at your disposal. And like I said, in the early stages of IndieFit, like we observed the problem to be, hey, people are building great businesses, but they're building it in a very technically disorganized way. And so let's build them some awesome software, right? Like let's help them streamline their business, simplify their lives, power automated marketing campaigns. I was a great founder for that, right? And I have like a technical, co-founder. And so we were
Yeah.
a perfect pair to build really robust business management software. But when I started to realize how much of this changed over time from I need software to like I need marketing coaching,
Yeah.
it's a different set of data. It's a different set of realities and things that we had learned. And so that's one thing I talk to a lot of other founders about is like you might have started in a position where you had perfect 100% founder market fit, and maybe your business evolved in a direction you didn't expect it to, or maybe you evolved as a person in a direction that you didn't expect yourself to. Maybe you fell in love with something else in the journey, right? I think
Yeah.
like businesses and people are living organisms. And so to
Yeah.
expect everything to stay
As
exactly the way
is.
it is when you start is unrealistic.
Yeah. Maybe hindsight 2020, I can definitely see you being an advisor for a founder who was a good founder product fit, I guess, product founder market fit or founder product fit for that business. Because I know you're so passionate about fitness and you want your friends in the industry, you wanted to support them. Being an investor or an advisor within that market could have been a really awesome, great fit. Do you have you thought about like because potentially have as well. It's resonating with me in the sense that sometimes I think I'm like, oh my god, this is such a great idea. I want to go build it, and then I'm like, wait, am I actually the best person to build it? Should I go find somebody else who's building that thing and support them in their journey because they're gonna win, and maybe invest in their company? Have you had that conversation with
Such an
yourself yet?
important question. I mean, back to our cheat sheet that you and I should create
Yeah.
together, right? It's like this is another one of
Listen.
those questions, right? It's like
Yeah.
people forget about distribution. They
Yeah.
also forget about founder market fit. Like they also forget about,
Yeah.
when you're in the early stages of, hey, I see a problem and I think I know the solution and I feel excited to build it. It's just so easy to have blind spots for things like how am I going to build it? And like, is it going to be the most fulfilling use of my potential for
Yeah.
5+ years, right? To chase this opportunity. It's such a tricky thing and it's a hard thing to know the answer to. And so I
Yeah.
think the other thing that I recommend in any of these really big decisions is like give them the time that they deserve. So, I
Yeah.
mean, in all honesty, we were seeing signals in our business dating all the way back to like October, November of last year. I had started to really start thinking about like, okay, what are the critical problems here? Do we need to make adjustments? I wasn't in a quit mindset. I was in a pivot mindset. And so I was still ultra committed, ultra married to it. But I felt like, okay, the business as it currently exists doesn't seem to be viable. So let's change some things. Like, let's figure out what we need to test into and evolve. And actually, where we landed with that was a realization that the world's not black and white. And so it's not just like build an independent fitness business or be an employee. A lot of people do both, right? Like they build a portfolio of ways that they earn income. And so what we realized is a lot of these same instructors who are building businesses are going back to
Hard.
studios. And this
Yeah.
studio now needs the tool set to help them empower and reward this person who is a more savvy type of employee than they've ever seen before. And so we had actually started to build a studio facing product. And we had built an MVP of that. We had secured some interesting partnerships. And so that's where my head was at, through the fall and through the early year was like, okay, it's time to just pivot and figure organizations and changes we need to make. But we know at this point, given the outcome,
Yeah.
armed with data that we came into over the months, I mean, even with those pivots, we still realized like this is just us scrambling to fix it at all costs, right? And we're getting ultra creative and like cheers to the creativity, but we're trying to force product market fit for something that doesn't have it.
Yeah.
So quite a journey, right? To go
Yeah.
on mentally in terms of decision making.
Yeah. I have one more question about this, and then I know we're at time, so we're gonna close out. But my question was about communication to employees, and you mentioned like this is a quiet time, and it probably feels really lonely. I know your partner, your technical founder, and you probably have had conversations about this. But what about the rest of the employees? Have you given thought about the leadership style of being like completely transparent and extremely volatile and tell them exactly where we are versus like putting up brave face and putting up like trying to like push through and motivating all the way through the end? And where did you fall, I guess, between the two extremes?
Such a good question. I think in the earlier stages, I mentioned that a couple of months ago, I was more in this pivot mindset.
Yeah.
At that time, I was being very, very thoughtful and intentional about the way I communicated with the team because I felt like if I sent a signal that the core thing wasn't working and like we were thinking about giving up on it, right? It's like you just can't even plant that seed in someone's head until it's really time to wind down, right? Because then it might become a self-fulfilling prophecy, And so it's like I do think that the brave face is super important when it comes to leading your team and your employees all the way up to the point that you're sure. And then once you're sure as a founder, radical transparency. Like flip that thing 100% on its head is my take on this. But I think that along that journey, the way that you communicate with your team and your employees and the way that you maybe communicate with like advisors and mentors who can give you good advice on this is wildly different because as mentioned, I feel like I was carrying a secret on my shoulders and it was a really heavy secret that was wearing me down and burning me out a little bit and I wasn't talking to nearly anyone about it. And I look back and I'm like, my team, they weren't the right ones to be venting and sharing these hard scary feelings with, but I needed to share them with someone. And so I think that's my advice for founders who are going through this phase is like find a great mentor. And like maybe that's a startup founder who wound down their own company. Maybe that's a founder who successfully pivoted and worked through the hard stuff. Find someone that can be your shoulder to lean on, but be really careful about indicating to your team that it's over before it's over, because then it probably will be over, right? Because that's how everybody will be operating. And then to kind of speak to the transparency at the very end of the process, it's a thing that everybody is hardwired to avoid. Like that classic, like sitting an employee down and telling them that things are coming to an end and they're going to have to find their next adventure. And similarly, sending the communication to your investors, right? Like nobody wants to write that email that's like, hey, thank you for believing in us. It didn't work and I can't return your capital. Like hitting send on that email is just like, you got to make like 10 laps around the house before you're ready to do that. But
Like
the
jumping
fact
around
that,
from push-ups.
yeah, I like joked with my co-founder who's based in LA. I'm like, I need you to fly out here and push this button because I can't do it. But because that is such a hard decision that it's human nature to want to avoid, that can lead some founders to drag this out and avoid this longer than they should. And I think now in hindsight, having gone through this, I realize that the second you rip the Band-Aid off, the pain stops, right? Like you're taking that weight that's on your shoulders and somebody else is carrying some of it for you. And people are so supportive, people are so kind. It opens up this like world of opportunity in terms of what you're going to do next. So, I think my advice on this is like rip the band-aid off and be very transparent in how you do it. So, I mean, we wrote a 3-page memo to our investors explaining exactly what we observed with data, exactly why we made this decision, exactly how we made this decision, total all cards on the table, right? Super transparent communication. And I had very similar conversations with our team, all one-on-one, focused a lot on the positive of like, how far I feel like I've come as a founder in personal outcomes and how I hope they feel the same, right? Like how much more marketable they are as they re-enter, the job world for having had this sort of early stage owner type experience. And I think, that process ended up going really smoothly. And I attribute most of how smooth it was to radical transparency. So big
Nice.
believer
I
in
love
that.
that. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Cheryl. What are you going to do next? What's going to happen? What's the future
So,
holding?
yeah, I mean, we actually have a pretty good indication, but it's a little bit in stealth mode. So,
Okay.
I'll give some hints, but nothing is official or able to be shared publicly right now. But coming out of IndieFit,
Yeah.
one thing that was top of mind for me was my partnership with my co-founder is one
Yes.
of the most valuable outputs of this entire experience. And so even though IndieFit is coming to an end, I really wanted to make sure that my partnership with him was not coming to an end. And fortunately, he was on the same page. So we did kind of make next steps decisions very collaboratively. And what we decided is we were really looking for something that, would of course leverage some of our expertise, but we were looking for an intentional learning opportunity. And so we were like, how do we put ourselves in an environment where we can like ramp up on Web3 or, learn something completely new and novel.
Yeah.
And we wanted to do that in a way that was somewhat flexible so that if we choose to, pursue another venture, next year or sometime like that, that we have the freedom to do so. And we've actually
Yeah.
found an opportunity that checks every box in terms of being an awesome learning opportunity, very flexible and a fit for our lifestyles. And it actually is with somebody who was an investor in IndieFit. So sometimes
Wow.
these things come full circle, right? And there might
Yeah.
be some hidden pot of gold at the end of the rainbow that you really can't see until you get to the end
Yeah.
of the process. And so many times those outcomes are related to people, like the co-founder you find, the network you build.
Yes.
You just never know how those things are going to pay off at the end of the experience.
I love it. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I love having you on. Cannot wait for you to come back on your next venture, and we're gonna talk about that. I'm gonna have you come back every single time you do something.
Well, I can't wait. And I
We
always
can do the little,
enjoy.
yeah. Yeah, we
Oh,
can
go
do
ahead.
the little
Sorry.
cheat sheet, that little product thing. I think it would be really helpful whether you do it in your blog or as a memo. I think people would definitely gravitate towards that and towards your learning. So I hope you share that.
Yeah, it's definitely something I'm planning to spend a little time on. There's a lot of reflection and learning in my head, and I'm like, I need to carve out some time to put that on a digital paper, so to speak, and share it
Yeah.
with the world, which, as you know, is something I love to do.